The ghost ship in the Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle. Just the name itself conjures images of vanishing ships, eerie calm waters, and unexplained mysteries. While some believe it's nothing more than a geographic coincidence, others swear that the area holds secrets beyond human understanding. For marine archaeologist Dr. Alice Munro, the Bermuda Triangle represented the ultimate challenge. Over the years, she had listened to countless rumors from sailors, researchers, and conspiracy theorists alike about the strange occurrences there. But Alice wasn't interested in myths. She wanted to uncover the truth. It was the autumn of 2017 when she received a peculiar message from a local fisherman based in Nassau. He claimed to have spotted a shipwreck that hadn't been there the week before. A large vessel half submerged in shallow waters, but in an area known to have no wrecks for miles. Even stranger, the fisherman swore that he could sometimes see lights flickering on the deck at night. At first, Alice was skeptical. Ships don't just appear out of nowhere, she had muttered to herself, closing the message. But a creeping curiosity gnawed at her, the kind that an archaeologist couldn't ignore. What if this was a previously undiscovered wreck? What if it was more than just a shipwreck? After some convincing, she gathered her dive team, seasoned marine biologist Carl, tech specialist Megan, and her loyal assistant Jake, who had a knack for sensing when things were off. Together, they chartered a small research vessel and headed into the depths of the Bermuda Triangle, following the coordinates sent by the fishermen. As they reached the location, the ocean lay unnervingly still under a sky shrouded in mist. Their boat gently rocked in place, surrounded by an eerie silence. It wasn't long before Jake, who had been scanning the area with binoculars, spotted something. "Over there," he called out, voice tense. "There's something big." Alice and the others looked out in the direction he was pointing. Sure enough, through the mist, the shape of an enormous ship emerged, a vessel nearly intact but covered in layers of rust and barnacles, with no name or identifying marks visible on the hull. "This is it," Alice said, her voice a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "This ship, it shouldn't be here." They suited up, descending into the water with underwater lights flickering through the gloomy sea. As they got closer to the vessel, an unexplainable chill settled over them. The closer they got, the more they felt like they were being watched. And then they heard it, the faint sound of bells echoing through the water. The dive lights cut through the murky depths as the team approached the shipwreck. Shadows danced across the corroded hull, making it look like the ship was alive, breathing in and out with the sway of the ocean. Dr. Alice Munro kept her breathing steady, but her heartbeat thrummed with a mix of excitement and something she couldn't quite place. Was it fear? They reached the side of the wreck where the ship's name should have been painted, but instead of letters there was nothing but scraped bare metal, as though someone or something had intentionally removed any trace of identity. "This isn't a typical wreck," muttered Carl through the radio, his voice crackling with static. "It looks preserved, but aged at the same time." "Agreed," said Megan, her flashlight scanning across the deck. She paused, her light catching something odd, a set of footprints, clearly visible in the algae and grime. The prints led across the deck, disappearing into the darkness near the captain's quarters. "Hey, Alice, are you seeing this?" Alice swam over and squinted at the prints. They looked fresh, but that was impossible. The ship had supposedly been submerged for decades, judging by the layers of rust and marine life clinging to it. A cold shiver slid down her spine. "Let's proceed with caution," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Stay close, everyone." They moved as a group, inching their way down the eerie, silent deck. The water seemed to get colder the further they went, and the shadows seemed to press in, thickening around them. Alice had an overwhelming sense of trespassing, like they were intruding on a place they weren't supposed to be. As they passed an open doorway leading into the ship's interior, a sudden clanging sound reverberated from within, echoing through the water. Each of them froze, exchanging glances, and Alice caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness, a shadow gliding swiftly out of sight. "Did anyone else see that?" Jake asked, his voice laced with dread. "Stay calm," Alice replied, though her hands were trembling. She felt a growing unease, as if the ship itself was watching them, waiting for them to go deeper. She knew they should turn back, but curiosity outweighed caution. They pressed on. The team ventured inside into the narrow corridors of the ship. The walls were covered in splotches of rust, but strangely, other areas were spotless, gleaming as though they had been polished. Here and there, personal belongings floated. An old shoe, a watch still ticking, a crew member's name badge with R. Hawthorne scrawled in faded ink. Then they saw it, a dim light flickering down the hall, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and reach toward them. There's no way, Carl stammered, staring at the light. There's no power source. How could there be? It's probably just residual gas emissions, Megan said, though her tone was far from convinced. They edged closer to the light, but it vanished, flickering out as if it sensed their approach. Alice turned to Jake, but he wasn't looking at the light. His eyes were wide, fixed on a corner of the room behind them. There's someone here, he whispered. They turned as one, flashlights landing on a figure at the end of the corridor. A man, or what looked like a man, dressed in an old-fashioned captain's uniform, his back turned to them. He was impossibly still, hovering slightly off the ground, unmoving. "Hello?" Alice called out, her voice quivering. She regretted it immediately as the figure slowly turned to face them. What they saw wasn't a man. The captain's face was pale, eyes hollow, as though all the life had been drained from him. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and then, in the blink of an eye, he vanished, dissolving into the shadows. The team was frozen, each of them struggling to process what they'd just seen. "Did that really happen?" Megan asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here," Carl said, backing toward the exit. But as they turned to leave, a new sound filled the water. A faint rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on a metal pipe. Tap, tap, tap. They swiveled, trying to locate the source, but the sound echoed from all directions, growing louder, as if it was following them, herding them deeper into the ship. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on them. Alice glanced back at the corridor they'd just left. It looked longer, stretching into darkness, far longer than it should have been. "Don't look back," she told the others, a sense of dread settling over her. She didn't know why, but every instinct screamed that they couldn't look back, not if they wanted to leave. As they made their way back to the deck, they noticed more oddities. A half-empty mug still upright, as if someone had just left it there. A faded newspaper headline from 1963 reading "Crew Lost at Sea," and, disturbingly, an old captain's log, its pages turning as if an invisible hand was flipping through it. Jake, unable to resist, reached out and caught the log in his hand. The page was dated just a few days ago, yet the ink was faded, as if it had been written decades prior. The entry read, "They come at night in the silence. I hear their voices, the voices of the lost. They beg for help, but they're not alive. Not anymore. The ship is cursed. We're all cursed. God forgive us." Jake's face went pale, and he dropped the log as if it burned him. What does this mean?" Before anyone could respond, the floor beneath them creaked, and a sudden violent jolt threw them to the ground. It felt as if the entire ship was shifting, rearranging itself to trap at them. "We need to get out, now!" Alice shouted, pulling Jake to his feet. They scrambled back to the deck, but the sight that met them made their blood run cold. The exit they'd used to enter the ship was gone, replaced by an unending corridor that twisted and turned in impossible ways, like a maze. And then, from somewhere deep within the ship, they heard it, a low, mournful hum, like the sound of an old choir. It rose and fell, echoing around them, filling every corner, every shadow. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, yet there was a sadness to it, a longing that seemed to seep into their bones. As the hum grew louder, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Pale, spectral figures drifted toward them, their faces empty and hollow. They wore the uniforms of sailors, some with long, tattered coats, others in simple shirts. but all with eyes like empty voids. One by one, they raised their hands, pointing at the divers, beckoning them deeper into the ship. "We can't stay here," Megan screamed, backing away. Alice felt herself being pulled, an almost hypnotic urge to follow the figures, to answer their silent call. She shook herself, grabbing hold of the nearest wall, anchoring herself in place. "We have to fight it," she shouted. "Don't listen to them." But Jake was already moving toward them, his eyes glassy, as though he were sleepwalking. They need help," he mumbled, his voice distant. "They're lost. They need us." Alice and Carl rushed to pull Jake back, snapping him out of his trance just as he reached the edge of a gaping hole in the deck. Below, a black abyss yawned open, swirling with the shadows. "It's a trick," Alice shouted, shaking him. "They're not real. Whatever they are, they're trying to trap us here." Jake blinked, his eyes clearing, and he looked down at the hole, shivering. I don't know what happened. I heard them calling me." "It's okay," Carl said, gripping his shoulder. "Let's just get out of here." But the spirits weren't finished. The ship began to groan and creak, its very structure bending and twisting as if alive, like it was trying to swallow them whole. The corridors they'd come through twisted in on themselves, blocking their path, forcing them further into the heart of the vessel. "Stick together," Alice commanded. "No matter what happens, don't split up." They stumbled down a narrow staircase, descending into the belly of the ship. The deeper they went, the colder it became, until their breath fogged in front of their masks. And all the while, the ghostly choir grew louder, surrounding them, pressing in from every direction. Finally, they reached a room, a vast empty cargo hold. The walls were lined with rows upon rows of photographs, old and faded, each one showing the face of a different crew member. Alice stared, horror dawning on her as she recognized some of the faces from the spectral figures they'd encountered. These are the lost," she whispered. "These are the souls trapped here." But as she reached out to touch one of the photos, a voice echoed through the room, low and chilling. "Join us, forever." The photos began to move, their eyes following the team, mouths twisting into expressions of rage and despair. The walls shook, and the air grew thick, heavy with the weight of countless lost souls. "We have to go," Carl shouted, grabbing Alice's arm. Together they sprinted toward the far end of the cargo hold, praying for an escape. The voices rose in a deafening chorus, the walls closing in around them, and the ship itself seemed to reach out, claws of shadow grasping at them as they ran. In the depths of the icy black water, Alice struggled, kicking her legs and clawing upward, desperate for air. But the hands of the dead were everywhere, grabbing, pulling, anchoring her in the darkness. Just when it seemed she would drown, she felt a sharp tug from above. Breaking the surface, she gasped for air, disoriented but somehow free of the hands. Carl had managed to pry the door open just enough to create a crack. He and Jake were pulling her through, and she could see Megan on the other side pounding on the door. "Come on," Jake yelled, his voice hoarse with fear. They squeezed through the narrow opening, leaving the cursed water and the ghostly hands behind, slamming the door shut. But as they turned to run, they realized they weren't out of danger yet. The shadows had returned, drifting along the walls, whispering and moaning, forming a path that led them to the deck. The way was clear now, the ship guiding them, as if it wanted them to leave, or maybe it was just toying with them, offering a glimmer of hope before snatching it away. They stumbled onto the deck, drenched and gasping for air. The ship was changing, shifting, the walls seeming to breathe as the ship itself exhaled. Fog billowed in from the open ocean, blanketing the deck in thick white mist. "We're almost there," Alice said, voice trembling. "We can make it back to the boat." But as they moved toward the edge of the ship, the fog parted, revealing the captain one final time, blocking their path. Behind him stood dozens of crew members, their faces blank and hollow, waiting for the newcomers to join them. "Turn back, or stay forever," the captain intoned, his voice echoing through the fog. For a moment it seemed as if they were trapped. The crew began to close in, a wall of silent figures with empty, soulless eyes, reaching out with ghostly hands. Alice gripped Jake's hand, her mind racing. She didn't know how to fight them, but she couldn't let her team become just another part of the ship's haunted history. Then she remembered the logbook, the entry that mentioned the ship's weakness, how it was bound by a curse. If they could break the connection, they might be able to escape. "Grab anything metal, anything flammable," Alice ordered, frantically searching through the debris scattered across the deck. "We have to destroy the logbook." Jake found a flare gun and Megan managed to gather a pile of dry seaweed and rags. They ripped the logbook from Jake's hands and threw it onto the makeshift pyre, setting it ablaze. The flames roared to life, licking at the old brittle pages, sending up a plume of smoke. As the fire consumed the book, the captain and his crew let out a blood-curdling scream, their forms flickering, dissolving, as if their very essence was tied to the cursed log. The ship shook violently, the deck splintering and cracking beneath them, as the souls trapped within were finally set free. The fog began to lift, and the spectral crew members faded into the mist, leaving only silence behind. The team stumbled onto their own boat, collapsing in exhausted, terrified relief. They watched as the ghost ship slowly disappeared into the fog, fading from view until only the churning ocean remained. Alice slumped against the railing, staring at the empty sea where the ship had been. "Do you think it's really over?" Jake asked, still shaken. Alice looked down at the charred remnants of the logbook in her hands, its pages now reduced to ash. "I don't know, but whatever that place was, it's where they belong, and they're staying there." As they powered up the engine and began the journey back to shore, none of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. The Bermuda Triangle was known for its mysteries, its tales of the unexplained, but now they each carried a truth they couldn't deny, a tale too horrifying for words. They had escaped the ghost ship, but they knew they would never forget the haunting cries of the lost souls or the chilling gaze of the captain. The Bermuda Triangle had allowed them to leave, but part of each of them would forever remain in that cursed dark place. And deep in the ocean, beyond the reach of sunlight, the ghost ship waited once more, a beacon for those drawn to the unknown, its curse ready to welcome the next lost souls into its eternal night. The deep-sea diver who heard voices. The Mariana Trench, the deepest, most foreboding place on Earth. Known as Challenger Deep, its bottom lies nearly 7 miles below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Few people have dared to descend into its crushing depths, and fewer still have returned unchanged. The crushing darkness, the intense pressure, and the uncharted mysteries lurking below have turned it into a place of legend, where even the bravest souls fear to tread. One such soul was Alex Warren, a seasoned deep-sea diver with a reputation for pushing the limits of human endurance. Alex had dived the shipwrecks of the North Atlantic, explored underwater caverns in the Mediterranean, and had even mapped out parts of the Antarctic seafloor. But none of those experiences prepared him for what he would find in the Mariana Trench. In the summer of 2022, Alex was recruited for an experimental dive as part of a scientific expedition funded by an anonymous organization. The mission was simple: reach the bottom of Challenger Deep, collect samples, and test new equipment designed to withstand the immense pressure of the trench. But there was an added task, one that intrigued him more than any other. "While you're down there," the lead scientist, Dr. Elena Morgan, had said, "we'd like you to capture audio recordings from the bottom. It's uncharted territory, and we have reason to believe there may be unique phenomena." Alex had raised an eyebrow. "Unique phenomena? Like what?" Dr. Morgan hesitated, glancing around the room before answering. "We don't know exactly, but there have been reports. Strange sounds, faint voices, things that don't make sense. We're hoping your recordings will shed some light on these mysteries." Alex had shrugged it off, figuring the scientists were being overly cautious. But now, as he sat inside the titanium-hulled submersible, descending into the deepest point on Earth, he felt a gnawing unease that he couldn't shake. The journey to the trench floor took hours, and as he descended, the light from the surface faded, leaving him in total darkness. Outside, the pressure mounted, pressing against the submersible's reinforced hull. The faint creaking sounds were a constant reminder that any structural weakness could mean his doom. When he finally reached the bottom, the onboard sensors began their work, measuring the water temperature, analyzing the soil, and scanning the trench floor. Alex switched on the recording equipment, letting it capture the ambient sounds of the trench. The submersible was filled with a deep silence, broken only by the soft hum of the machinery. That was when he heard it, the faintest of whispers. At first he thought it was interference, some flaw in the recording equipment. But the whisper grew louder, forming words, syllables, though he couldn't quite make out what they were saying. His breath hitched as he strained to listen. Help. Us. The words were faint, barely perceptible, but they were unmistakably human. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. He checked the subsystems, wondering if it was some kind of glitch, but everything was functioning normally. The voice persisted, growing louder and clearer with each passing second. Please, don't leave us. Alex gripped the console, heart pounding as the voices filled the cabin. They sounded desperate, pleading, like the cries of people trapped in some endless, eternal void. He tried to ignore them, focusing on his task, but the voices wouldn't stop. They grew louder, filling the sub with a cacophony of whispers and moans, each one carrying a weight of sorrow and despair. Then a new voice broke through the noise, deeper and more menacing than the rest. Come, join us. Alex's blood turned to ice. He looked out the viewport, but all he could see was darkness, an endless abyss stretching out in every direction. He knew he was alone down here, miles below the surface, and yet he didn't feel alone. The voice echoed again, this time clearer, more insistent. Come, join us. Alex reached for the controls, his hand shaking as he prepared to ascend. But as he pressed the button, the sub's power flickered and died. The lights went out, and the hum of the machinery fell silent, leaving him in total darkness. Panic set in as he tried to restart the systems, but nothing worked. He was trapped, stranded in the deepest place on Earth, surrounded by a darkness that felt alive, pressing in on him from all sides. And then he felt it. A cold, clammy hand resting on his shoulder. Alex froze, his entire body tense as he felt the cold hand on his shoulder. He was alone in the submersible, thousands of feet beneath the ocean's surface. No one else should have been there. And yet the sensation was unmistakable, as if a hand had materialized from the shadows, reaching out to claim him. He spun around, but of course there was no one there, just the cramped interior of the sub bathed in darkness. His mind raced, scrambling for a logical explanation, but there was none. The voice, the touch, it all defied reason. A distorted, static-laden voice crackled over his radio. Alex, come to us. It wasn't a familiar voice. It sounded warped and distant, like it was coming from another world. Alex's heart pounded as he gripped the controls, desperately trying to reboot the subsystems. But the buttons and levers were unresponsive, as though the sub itself had fallen under some dark, paralyzing spell. Alex, you are close. The voice echoed in his ears, and this time he could hear the faint sounds of others in the background, as if a chorus of souls were whispering his name, urging him to join them. He tried to calm himself, breathing deeply as he reached for the emergency power switch. If he could get the lights back on, maybe he'd feel a semblance of safety, or at least gain his bearings in the abyss. His fingers found the switch, and with a flick he engaged it. A faint flickering light illuminated the sub's interior, casting long, eerie shadows. The darkness outside the viewport remained absolute, but the small light inside the cabin was enough to keep his mounting panic at bay. Then, as if mocking his feeble attempt to regain control, a face appeared outside the viewport. It was pale and distorted, floating just inches from the glass. The face was twisted in an expression of agony, eyes wide and empty, mouth frozen in a silent scream. The features were blurred as if submerged in water, but Alex could make out enough to feel the horror. His breath caught in his throat as he realized it wasn't just a face. There were others. More faces looming behind it, pressed against the glass, all staring at him with the same hollow gaze. The radio crackled again, filled with the sounds of tortured voices. "Join us, Alex. Join us. Forever." He recoiled, backing away from the viewport, but there was nowhere to go. The sub was tiny, and the faces pressed closer, filling the glass as if trying to claw their way inside. He could feel their hunger, their desperation, a tidal wave of despair pressing against him from every direction. "Stay calm, Alex. This isn't real. It can't be real," he muttered to himself, trying to stay grounded in the present. But the voices were relentless, each one a whisper from the depths, each word dripping with sorrow and malice. The faces faded, dissolving into the blackness outside the sub, but the voices continued, circling him, taunting him. "Down here, no one returns," one voice hissed. Another chimed in. "We have waited so long." His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. These voices sounded so real, so full of emotion, but they couldn't be. He was alone, isolated in the deepest part of the ocean, yet he felt surrounded, trapped by the weight of countless souls. Just then, the main power flickered back on, bathing the cabin in harsh light. Alex scrambled for the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons to initiate the ascent. He didn't care if it meant abandoning the mission. Whatever lay at the bottom of Challenger Deep wasn't meant to be disturbed. As the sub began its slow rise, Alex exhaled a sigh of relief. The voices had faded and the crushing pressure of the darkness seemed to recede, but his relief was short-lived. A few minutes into the ascent, the sub jerked to a halt. Alex checked the monitors, panic flaring again as he realized the ascent had stopped. It was as if something were holding him in place, refusing to let him leave. Then the radio crackled one more time, the static louder than ever. And through the static he heard a voice he recognized, a voice that made his blood run cold. It was the voice of his father. "Alex, why did you leave us?" Alex's stomach twisted. His father had passed away years ago, lost at sea during a routine dive off the coast of Alaska. Alex had been a teenager at the time, and the tragedy had shaped his life, driving him to pursue a career as a diver. But hearing his father's voice now, in this place in the darkness, it was impossible. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Yes, son, it's me. We've been waiting for you," the voice replied, filled with an unearthly calm that sent chills down his spine. "Waiting here." Alex's voice broke. You can't be here." The voice laughed, a hollow, eerie sound that echoed through the cabin. "There are many of us here, Alex. Lost souls. We're all waiting." Alex shook his head, gripping the controls. This isn't real. You're not real." But the voice persisted, soft and insistent. "Come deeper, Alex. Join us in the dark. You know you belong here. You've always belonged here." The sub lurched again, and Alex's heart pounded as he realized he was sinking, descending back into the trench against his will. His fingers flew to the controls, trying to override the descent, but it was useless. Something was pulling him down, dragging him back toward the ocean floor. Outside the viewport, the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from all sides. And as he sank, he saw them again. The faces, countless faces, all twisted in agony, all reaching out to him with skeletal hands. "Join us. Join us," they chanted, their voices a mournful chorus that filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts. The sub continued its descent, faster now, plummeting into the abyss. The faces grew clearer, their expressions more desperate, as if each one carried the weight of a tragic story, a life cut short, a soul trapped in eternal darkness. Finally, the sub hit the bottom with a jolt. Alex braced himself, his breathing ragged as he looked out the viewport. The faces were gone. The darkness was complete. He sat there, his heart racing, every nerve in his body on edge. And then slowly the voices began again, a cacophony of whispers and wails, each one filled with longing and despair. "Help us. Free us. We're trapped. Alex clenched his fists, feeling an overwhelming urge to help, to do something to release these tormented souls. But what could he do? He was as helpless as they were, trapped in the depths of the Mariana Trench, surrounded by darkness. Then he noticed something, a faint pulsing light in the distance. It was barely visible, but it was enough to break through the blackness, a small glimmer of hope in the vast void. Without thinking, Alex activated the thrusters, guiding the sub toward the light. As he approached, he realized it wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a doorway. The doorway stood alone, a structure made of some ancient, unknown metal, covered in strange symbols that glowed with an otherworldly light. It looked out of place, as if it didn't belong in this world. He felt an overwhelming compulsion to go through it, as if the souls were pulling him toward the doorway, urging him to cross over. But then a voice cut through the whispers, a voice clear and strong, filled with warning. "Do not enter." Alex froze, his hand hovering over the controls. The voice was different from the others, authoritative and powerful. It wasn't pleading, it was commanding. "Turn back now," the voice continued, "or be lost forever." For a moment, Alex was torn. The doorway beckoned, a portal to something beyond his understanding, a way to escape the crushing darkness. But the voice filled him with dread, a deep primal fear that warned him of unimaginable consequences. He glanced at the doorway one last time, feeling the pull of the souls, the desperate longing that filled the trench. But he forced himself to turn the sub around, activating the thrusters and pulling away from the light. As he ascended, the voices grew fainter, fading into the background until there was only silence. When he finally broke the surface, sunlight flooded the cabin, blinding him after so long in the dark. He gasped, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the warmth on his face. But the memory of the trench lingered, the voices echoing in his mind, the faces pressed against the glass. The doorway that led to something unknown and unspeakable. Alex knew he'd never forget what he'd seen, what he'd heard. And as he looked back at the ocean, he realized that a part of him would always remain down there, in the depths, with the lost souls of the Mariana Trench. The haunting of the abandoned oil rig. The Gulf of Mexico stretched out as far as the eye could see, an endless expanse of deep blue water beneath a pale sky. Somewhere out there, floating in eerie isolation, was Rig 13, the oil rig that had been abandoned almost a decade earlier under mysterious circumstances. Dr. Samantha Harlow was not one to believe in ghost stories. She was a marine biologist, a scientist who had built her career on evidence and reason. When she received a grant to study marine life near abandoned structures, she was thrilled to take on Rig 13 as her first site. Still, she'd heard the rumors. "Don't go near it," one fisherman had told her at the dock. "That place ain't right. People say it's haunted." Another sailor had only given her a stern warning. "People who go to Rig 13 don't come back the same, if they come back at all." Samantha had laughed off the warnings, but now, as she looked out over the water from the research boat, a chill crawled down her spine. Rig 13 loomed in the distance, an enormous metal skeleton rising from the depths, silhouetted against the sky. Rusted and crumbling, it looked like a ghost of the industry that had once thrived there. With her team assembled, Ryan, the tech specialist, Luis, the equipment manager, and Emily, her research assistant, they approached the rig with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "All right, let's get this done," Samantha said, trying to keep her voice steady as they anchored beside the structure. As they climbed up onto the platform, they found themselves surrounded by an eerie silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the rig. The wind whistled through the abandoned pipes, creating a haunting melody that echoed across the empty decks. "It's like a graveyard," Emily muttered, glancing nervously around. The shadows seemed to move and shift, as if hiding something that was just out of sight. "Don't worry," Samantha replied with a reassuring smile. "We are just here to take some samples, measure a few things, and we'll be out before sunset." But as the team began their work, They quickly realized that Rig 13 was anything but normal. Samantha had planned to start by examining the marine life that had taken over the rig, expecting to find fish, algae, maybe even some rare species. But as she set up her instruments, she noticed something unsettling, a feeling of being watched. She brushed it off, attributing it to nerves, until Ryan tapped her on the shoulder, his face pale. "Sam, did you hear that?" "Hear what?" she asked, frowning. Then she heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on metal. Tap, tap, tap. "Probably just the wind," she said, though her voice wavered. Ryan didn't look convinced. "It sounds like, footsteps." The tapping continued, echoing from deep within the structure. Each tap was steady, measured, as if someone or something was moving slowly toward them. The sound sent a shiver down Samantha's spine, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The team continued working, but the uneasy feeling only grew. Every so often, one of them would glance over their shoulder, convinced they'd seen a shadow moving, only to find nothing there. Then Louise, who had been working near the edge of the platform, called out, "Hey, is there supposed to be power on this rig?" Samantha frowned. "No, it's been abandoned for years. There's no way anything should be working." But Louise pointed down the platform, where a single dim light flickered on and off, casting eerie shadows across the rusted pipes. "That light wasn't on before," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Samantha tried to stay calm. "Probably a glitch. Some rigs have backup batteries that can last a while, or maybe there's still some residual energy in the system." But as the light continued to flicker, casting strange, shifting shadows, Samantha began to doubt her own explanation. "Let's just finish up here and get back to the boat," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. They worked quickly, gathering data and taking samples, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing minute. Then, without warning, the tapping sound stopped, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. It was Emily who noticed it first, a strange dark shape moving slowly across the deck. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing. The team turned, their flashlights illuminating the shape. At first they thought it was an animal, but as it moved into the light, they realized it was something far more unsettling. A pair of heavy, wet footprints, slowly appearing one by one, as if an invisible figure were walking toward them. What is that?" Ryan stammered, backing away. Before Samantha could respond, a low guttural whisper filled the air, echoing through the structure. "Get out!" The words were barely audible, but they carried a weight that chilled them to the bone. The footprints stopped, but the feeling of dread lingered, pressing down on them like a physical force. "We need to go," Louise said, his face pale. But as they turned to leave, they realized with horror that their path was blocked. The shadows had shifted, forming a thick, impenetrable wall that seemed to pulse and breathe. "There's no way around," Samantha whispered, panic rising in her chest. Then, as if in response, the shadows parted, revealing a narrow, twisting path that led deeper into the rig. The team exchanged glances, fear etched on their faces. They knew they shouldn't go deeper, that every instinct told them to turn back, but something compelled them to keep going, as if an unseen force were pulling them forward. With no other choice, they followed the path, each step taking them further from safety and closer to the dark heart of Rig 13. Samantha's heart beat in time with the faint hum of the machinery as they moved deeper into the rig. The air grew colder, filled with an acrid metallic tang that made her stomach turn. She wanted to turn back, to get her team out, but the path had twisted and curved so many times that she wasn't even sure which way would lead them out. Then they reached a door, a heavy rusted door with a small glass window. Beyond it, she saw something flickering, a dim light moving back and forth as if cast by an old malfunctioning flashlight. "Do we go in?" Ryan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Samantha hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong, but something pushed her forward, as though the rig itself wanted her to enter. With a trembling hand, she reached out and pulled the door open. The room beyond was dark and filled with the smell of rot and decay. Old equipment lay scattered across the floor, tangled in a mess of wires and seaweed. But it was the walls that caught her attention. They were covered in writing, strange symbols and words etched into the metal as though someone had carved them with their own fingernails. The letters were jagged, uneven, and filled with a sense of madness that made her skin crawl. What does it mean?" Emily asked, her voice shaking as she pointed at a particularly large symbol. Samantha shook her head, unable to answer. She felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to escape the darkness and the oppressive weight that seemed to press down on them from every point. Then a voice echoed through the room, soft and sorrowful. "We are here, trapped in the dark." Samantha froze, her heart pounding as she turned to face the source of the voice. But there was nothing there, only shadows flickering in the dim light. "Please, don't leave us." The voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was filled with an indescribable sadness that made her throat tighten. She felt an overwhelming sympathy for whoever had spoken, a longing to reach out, to help. But then another voice echoed, louder and more urgent. "Get out, leave while you can." Samantha backed away, her mind racing as she turned to her team. "We need to leave, now." They didn't argue, their faces pale as they hurried toward the exit. But as they reached the door, they found it blocked by a thick wall of shadows, the same impenetrable darkness that had forced them deeper into the rig. "Please, don't go." The voice was louder now, more insistent, and Samantha felt herself being pulled toward it, an invisible force tugging at her mind, filling her with an unbearable longing to stay. She fought against it, her mind screaming in protest as she struggled to keep moving. But then she saw them, figures pale and ghostly drifting toward them from the darkness. They wore old, faded uniforms, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and despair. Samantha's heart pounded as she realized who they were, the crew of Rig 13. The team stood frozen, staring at the ghostly figures as they floated toward them, their hands reaching out, their eyes filled with a hollow emptiness that made Samantha's blood run cold. "Don't leave us. Don't leave us alone in the dark." Their voices filled the room, a chorus of despair and longing that echoed through the metal walls, vibrating in Samantha's bones. Emily let out a strangled sob, her hands covering her ears as she backed away. This can't be happening. But there was no denying it. The crew was real, trapped in some horrible limbo, bound to the darkness of Rig 13 for eternity. Samantha felt a surge of empathy, a longing to help them, to set them free from their torment. But as she reached out, one of the ghostly figures moved forward, its hand extended. "You must stay. You must stay with us." The words were soft, almost gentle, but there was an edge of desperation that filled Samantha with dread. She pulled her hand back, her mind racing as she struggled to think of a way out. But the shadows had closed in, surrounding them, trapping them in the heart of the rig. "We can't leave," Ryan whispered, his voice filled with despair. "We're trapped." Samantha shook her head, refusing to believe it. There has to be a way out. There has to be. But even as she spoke, she knew it was hopeless. The crew was all around them, their eyes filled with a hunger that went beyond mere sadness, a longing that bordered on madness. And then she understood. They didn't want help. They didn't want freedom. They wanted company. The realization sent a chill down her spine, and she backed away, her eyes wide with horror as the crew moved closer, their faces twisted in grotesque smiles. "You belong with us. You must stay." Samantha turned, grabbing Ryan's hand as she ran toward the door, her mind filled with a single desperate thought. They had to escape. They had to escape before it was too late. But as they reached the door, the shadows closed in, and she felt a cold, clammy hand on her shoulder, pulling her back into the darkness. And in that moment, she knew they were never going to leave Rig 13. The Sirens of the Sunken City. The Sunken City lay just off the coast of Greece, hidden beneath centuries of silt, coral, and the relentless ocean current. Local legends whispered of an ancient city that had vanished beneath the waves thousands of years ago, swallowed by an earthquake or cursed by the gods themselves. But it was not the city that haunted the people of the nearby village. It was the Sirens that were said to guard it. According to legend, the Sirens had been trapped alongside the city, cursed to protect its secrets for eternity. They would sing to the living, luring divers, fishermen, and sailors to the depths, never to return. Most people in the village dismissed the tales as old folklore, but for those who had been close to someone lost in those waters, the legends felt disturbingly real. For marine archaeologist Dr. Elena Vasilakis, the tales were part of what drove her. Ever since she'd been a child, she'd been captivated by stories of lost cities, ancient curses, and the mysteries hidden beneath the waves. So when she received a grant to lead an expedition to the site of the supposed sunken city, she could hardly contain her excitement. It was her chance to prove that the city existed, and maybe, just maybe, to uncover the truth about the Sirens. Her team was small but experienced. Dmitri, a historian with a deep knowledge of Greek mythology. Lara, a diver and close friend who had been part of many of Elena's dives. And Costa, the photographer, who had a knack for capturing the haunting beauty of underwater ruins. Together they embarked on the dive that would take them to the ancient ruins. As they descended, the water grew darker, colder, the sunlight above them fading into a murky green. Fish darted around them, weaving through the remains of statues, broken columns, and crumbled walls that had once formed the city's grand structures. Elena's heart raced as she took in the sight. An entire civilization, frozen in time beneath the ocean. "This is incredible," Dmitri murmured, his voice filled with awe. "These carvings, they look Minoan, but different." Elena swam closer to the carvings, running her gloved fingers over the intricate designs. Strange figures adorned the stone, figures that seemed to twist and writhe, caught in poses of agony and despair. She frowned, feeling a chill despite the warmth of her wetsuit. "This doesn't look like any Minoan art I've seen," she said, her voice thoughtful. "It's almost supernatural." Costa's camera clicked as he captured images of the carvings, his eyes wide with fascination. "If these are depictions of the Sirens, they're a lot darker than I expected. Look at the expressions. These aren't just mermaids. They look tormented." Elena nodded, unable to tear her eyes from the figures. She felt a strange connection to them, a sense of sorrow and loss that tugged at her heart. She was about to say something when she heard it, a faint melodic hum drifting through the water. She froze, her ears straining to catch the sound. It was beautiful, haunting, like the soft notes of a lullaby carried on the current. She turned, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Lara nodded, her expression troubled. "It sounded like singing." Dmitri and Costa exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them admitted to hearing it. Elena's pulse quickened, her mind racing. She had read about divers experiencing auditory hallucinations, tricks of the mind caused by the pressure and the isolation of the deep sea. But this was different. She could feel the music, feel it resonating within her, pulling her forward. Without a word, she swam deeper into the city, following the sound. Her team hesitated, but they followed, their curiosity outweighing their fear. As they moved deeper into the ruins, the song grew louder, more beautiful, each note filling her with a strange, intoxicating warmth. She could feel the voices wrapping around her, whispering secrets, promising knowledge and power beyond her wildest dreams. Come closer," the voices sang, soft and alluring. Elena felt a surge of excitement, a need to reach the source of the music, to see what lay beyond the ruins. She pushed forward, her heart pounding with anticipation. She barely noticed her team's concerned glances, or the way they began to fall behind. "Wait," Dmitri called, his voice tinged with worry. "Elena, slow down." But she couldn't slow down. The song was calling to her, filling her with a longing that she couldn't ignore. It was as if the city itself were alive, reaching out to her, pulling her into its depths. Elena's heart beat in time with the haunting melody, each note luring her further into the shadows of the ruins. The song grew louder, wrapping around her like a warm embrace, promising secrets and wonders hidden in the depths. The voices were no longer faint whispers. They were clear and resonant, as though the sirens themselves were right beside her. She glanced over her shoulder, realizing her team had fallen behind. Dimitri and Costa's flashlights flickered faintly in the distance, but Lara was still close, her gaze fixed on Elena with a look of concern. "Elena, stop," Lara called out, her voice strained. "Something's not right here. We need to go back." Elena shook her head, her mind clouded by the music. She didn't want to go back. She couldn't. The song was too beautiful, too captivating to resist. "I have to see what's down there, Lara," she replied, her voice distant, almost dreamlike. "Don't you feel it? There's something here, something incredible." But Lara's face tightened, her hand reaching out to grab Elena's arm. "This isn't right. Look around you. We're in a place that no one's seen for thousands of years. There's a reason people don't come here." For a moment the spell wavered, and Elena felt a flash of clarity. She looked around, taking in the eerie silence, the shadowed ruins that seemed to close in on them. There was an unnatural stillness to the place, as if the city itself was watching them, waiting. And then she heard it, a single voice, stronger and clearer than the rest, calling her name. "Elena." The sound was beautiful, so familiar that it sent chills down her spine. She knew that voice, though she couldn't place where she'd heard it before. It was filled with warmth, with love, with a yearning that echoed in her soul. "Elena, come to us." Without thinking, she tore herself from Lara's grasp, swimming forward with renewed urgency. She could feel the voice pulling her, a siren's call that she couldn't ignore. "Elena, wait!" Lara cried, but her voice was distant, muffled by the song. Elena pushed forward, her flashlight slicing through the murky water as she navigated the labyrinth of ruins. She turned a corner, and suddenly she was there, in the heart of the city. The space opened up into a vast underwater plaza, surrounded by towering statues and intricately carved pillars. And in the center of the plaza, bathed in an ethereal light, stood 3 figures, their forms shimmering with an otherworldly glow. They were beautiful, more beautiful than anything Elena had ever seen. Their hair floated around them like strands of silver, their eyes wide and piercing, filled with a wisdom that transcended time. They were the Sirens, the guardians of the city, and they were watching her with a strange intensity. "Elena," they whispered in unison, their voices blending together into a harmony that sent shivers through her. "You have come at last." Her heart raced as she drifted closer, mesmerized by their beauty. She felt a warmth radiating from them, a comfort that erased all her fears, all her doubts. She was home. She was exactly where she was meant to be. What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The Sirens smiled, their expressions soft and inviting. "We have waited so long for someone like you, someone who can help us, someone who can set us free." Elena felt a surge of empathy, a connection to these beings that she couldn't explain. She wanted to help them, to release them from whatever curse had bound them to this place. "How?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. "Tell me what I need to do." One of the Sirens reached out, her hand glowing with a faint, shimmering light. "Come closer, Elena. Take our hand, and we will show you." Without hesitation, Elena extended her hand, her fingers brushing against the Siren's cool, smooth skin. As soon as they touched, a rush of images flooded her mind. A storm, a sinking city, the faces of people screaming in terror as the waters rose around them. She saw the Sirens bound to the ruins by an ancient spell, forced to guard the city for eternity. She felt their despair, their longing for freedom, their desire to escape the prison of the deep. "We are trapped here, Elena. The sirens whispered, their voices filled with sorrow. Bound by the curse of those who feared us, who sought to silence our song. Elena felt a pang of sympathy, her heart aching for the lost souls trapped in the ruins. She wanted to help them, to free them from their eternal torment. She nodded, her mind clouded by a fierce determination. "Tell me what I need to do," she said, her voice filled with resolve. The sirens smiled, their eyes shining with gratitude. "Come closer, Elena. Join us, and we will be free together." As she moved closer, she felt a strange sensation, a warmth spreading through her, filling her with a sense of peace, of belonging. She was exactly where she was meant to be. But then she heard another voice, a faint, desperate cry. "Don't listen to them." The voice was weak, barely audible, but it broke through the siren's spell, jolting her back to reality. She turned, seeing Lara swimming toward her, her face twisted in terror. "Elena, get away from them," Lara shouted, her voice trembling. "They're lying, they're not trapped, they're trying to trap you." The siren's smiles faded, their expressions darkening as they turned toward Lara. "Leave us," they hissed, their voices losing their beauty, becoming sharp, cruel. "She is ours now." Elena's mind swam with confusion. She looked from the sirens to Lara, her heart torn between the two. The sirens had seemed so kind, so full of sorrow and longing. But now, as she looked into their eyes, she saw something else, something dark, something hungry. She took a step back, her pulse racing as the sirens' hands reached out, their fingers curling around her arms like icy chains. "Elena, don't go," they whispered, their voices filled with a venomous sweetness. "You are one of us now. You belong here, with us, forever." Elena struggled, her mind clearing as the siren's true nature became horrifyingly clear. She was not their savior, their liberator. She was their prey. "Let go of me," she cried, pulling against their grip, but their fingers tightened, their faces twisting into expressions of rage and hunger. Lara grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her away from the sirens with all her strength. "We have to go," she shouted, her voice filled with the desperation. "Now!" They swam as fast as they could, the sirens' enraged voices echoing through the water, filling their ears with a furious, discordant wail. The beautiful melody had turned into a horrifying screech, each note filled with a wrath that chilled them to their cores. As they ascended, Elena could feel the sirens' presence, their cold hands reaching for her, their voices clawing at her mind, trying to drag her back down. She could feel their anger, their hunger, their desperate need for a new soul to take their place. When they finally broke the surface, gasping for air, the wailing stopped, leaving them in a heavy silence. They climbed onto their boat, trembling, their breaths ragged as they looked back at the dark water below. The ruins lay hidden beneath the waves, silent and still. But Elena knew the sirens were there, watching, waiting for the next soul to wander into their city, to be lured by their song. As they sailed back to shore, Elena felt a strange emptiness, a sense of loss that gnawed at her. She could still hear the faint echo of the siren's song in her mind, a melody that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The legend was true, after all. The sirens of the sunken city were real, and they were waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. The whispers from the ship graveyard. Off the coast of a remote island in the South Pacific lay a place few dared to explore, an underwater ship graveyard, a resting place for dozens of vessels lost in storms, wrecked by reefs, or simply abandoned to the depths. Over time, these ships had sunk into the seabed, forming a ghostly undersea labyrinth that was both a diver's dream and nightmare. Some locals called it the Grave of the Vanquished, others simply called it Cursed. For oceanographer and diver Talia Brooks, it was an opportunity to explore uncharted territory. She was fascinated by the mysteries of shipwrecks and the stories they held. But this dive was special, even for her. The local fishermen had warned her of strange happenings around the graveyard, whispers in the water, eerie visions, and a feeling of being watched. But Talia had chalked it up to superstition until now. Her team consisted of Ben, a seasoned diver, Luca, a historian, and Sam, a photographer tasked with documenting their findings. As they neared the site, Talia couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The sea seemed darker here, the waters still and ominous, as if even the ocean held its breath. "Are we ready to go in?" Ben asked, his voice tense as he adjusted his gear. "Ready as we'll ever be," Talia replied, suppressing the chill creeping up her spine. She triple-checked her oxygen tank and dive computer, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline as they prepared to descend. One by one, they plunged into the depths, the water growing colder as they approached the ship graveyard. Sunlight filtered through in faint rays, illuminating the silhouettes of the sunken ships below, their twisted frames forming a haunting undersea city. As they descended, Talia's radio crackled and she heard Ben's voice laced with apprehension. "Look at this place. It's like a graveyard." She didn't answer, too mesmerized by the sight before her. The wrecks were scattered across the seabed, their hulls twisted and broken, some half buried in the sand, others draped in long flowing seaweed like funeral shrouds. It was beautiful, in a tragic sort of way. They moved forward, weaving through the skeletal remains of ships from different eras. There were old wooden vessels, their masts broken and splintered, and more modern steel ships, their rusted hulls covered in barnacles. Each wreck told a story of a life lost, a voyage cut short. "Luca, any idea what kind of ship this is?" Talia asked, gesturing to a large corroded vessel with faded markings on the hull. Luca swam closer, running a gloved hand over the metal. "This looks like a freighter from the 1940s, maybe military. Hard to say with all the damage." Sam's camera flashed, capturing images of the wreck as they moved deeper into the graveyard. The silence was overwhelming, a heavy, oppressive quiet broken only by the faint hum of their breathing apparatus. Then suddenly Talia heard it, a faint whisper drifting through the water. She froze, glancing around, but there was nothing, only the silent hulks of the sunken ships. She shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination, but the whisper came again, louder this time. "Talia." Her heart raced. It was her name, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and strange, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ben's voice came through the radio, equally unsettled. "Hear what?" "I didn't hear anything." Luca and Sam exchanged nervous glances, but neither of them seemed to have heard it. Talia took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She'd heard stories of underwater hallucinations, tricks of the mind caused by the cold and the pressure. That had to be it. But as they swam further into the graveyard, the whispers grew louder. The whispers followed Talia and her team as they swam deeper into the ship graveyard, seeming to slip in and out of her consciousness, just on the edge of hearing. Every time she tried to focus, they faded, like distant echoes carried by the current. But as they drifted further into the shadows of the sunken vessels, the voices became clearer, each one distinct, filled with an urgent, pleading tone. "Talia, come closer. We are waiting." Talia clenched her jaw, willing herself to ignore them. But the voices were relentless, growing louder, as if each syllable reverberated through the water and straight into her bones. She could feel a strange energy around her, a heaviness pressing down on her, an invisible weight that seemed to pull her deeper into the graveyard. "Do you hear that?" she asked, glancing over at Luca, who was studying the rusted remains of a smaller vessel. Luca shook his head, his eyes wary. "No, but I'm starting to feel something." Ben joined them, his brow furrowed beneath his mask. "Feels like we're being watched, doesn't it?" They exchanged uneasy glances. Even Sam, normally composed and focused on capturing images, looked visibly shaken as he swam close to the group, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. The team pressed on, moving through the twisted labyrinth of wrecks. The deeper they went, the more surreal it became. Shadows danced along the hulls of sunken ships, shifting and morphing in strange, unsettling patterns. Here and there, strange artifacts floated by. A worn leather shoe, a rusted pocket watch, a frayed piece of cloth with faded initials. And always the voices followed them, whispering, beckoning. "Talia, please, don't leave us." She pushed forward, feeling an invisible pull that she couldn't ignore, though she knew they should leave. As Talia swam deeper into the ship graveyard, the voices grew more intense, each syllable echoing in her mind like a hypnotic pulse. It was as though the water itself was speaking, resonating with the sorrow and desperation of countless lost souls. She could feel the weight of their despair pressing down on her, pulling her closer to the source of the whispers. Ahead, she spotted the remains of a large ship, a vessel that looked more intact than any they'd encountered so far. Its hull was twisted and warped, half buried in the sand, yet it stood upright as if defying the ocean's relentless decay. The ship's name was barely visible on its rusted side. The Andromeda. "Ben, Luca, Sam," she called over the radio, her voice wavering. "I'm heading toward the Andromeda. There's something different about this one." Ben's voice came back, sounding hesitant. "Are you sure, Talia? Maybe we should stick together. This place is giving me the creeps." But Talia was already moving forward, drawn by an inexplicable urge. The voices had become almost soothing, like a lullaby, calling her to the Andromeda's darkened corridors. As she entered the ship's hull, her flashlight illuminated the empty, decaying interior. Moss and seaweed hung from the ceiling like a tapestry of the ocean's claim, while fish darted in and out of the open doors and windows. She swam through the narrow hallways, each turn taking her deeper into the ship's dark, silent heart. The whispers grew louder, filling her ears with a chorus of voices. "Help us. Set us free." It was a plea, raw and filled with pain. The sound resonated within her, stirring an empathy she couldn't shake. She wanted to help, to find some way to release these souls from whatever torment they were trapped in. Finally, she entered a large chamber near the center of the ship, a place that looked like it had once been a gathering room or mess hall. The walls were covered in faded, peeling murals depicting the Andromeda's voyages, but it was the floor that caught her attention. Scattered across the ground were artifacts, old photographs, trinkets, jewelry, each one preserved as though protected by an invisible barrier. Talia reached down, picking up a locket covered in rust. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a woman, her face frozen in a haunting smile. "Help us." The voices were everywhere now, filling the chamber, wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating fog. She felt a presence, an unseen force pressing against her, urging her to do something, though she couldn't understand what. Then out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her form ghostly and translucent, her face filled with sorrow. She wore a simple dress, her hair drifting around her as if suspended in water. Her eyes met Talia's, and a shiver ran down her spine. "Please, help us," the woman whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Talia's heart pounded as she took a step back, her mind racing. How can I help you?" The woman's gaze softened, filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. She raised a hand, pointing to a small door at the back of the chamber. "There, beyond that door, lies the truth of why we're here, of why we cannot leave." Before Talia could respond, the woman faded into the shadows, leaving only silence in her wake. She hesitated, her pulse racing as she glanced at the door the woman had indicated. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave this place behind and never return. But the pull was too strong. She had to know the truth. With a deep breath, she swam toward the door, pushing it open with trembling hands. The room beyond was pitch black, an impenetrable void that seemed to swallow all light. She activated her flashlight, its beam piercing the darkness, revealing the outlines of strange, twisted shapes. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces dark and cracked, and in each mirror Talia saw faces, dozens, maybe hundreds, each one staring at her with hollow, desperate eyes. She gasped, backing away, but the faces followed her, each one watching her with a mix of longing and despair. "Set us free," they whispered, their voices blending together in a haunting symphony. "We are trapped, bound to this place, until someone breaks the curse." Talia felt a chill run down her spine. She'd heard of cursed objects, of souls trapped in mirrors or artifacts, unable to move on. But an entire ship? An entire crew? "How?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How can I break the curse?" One of the faces moved closer, its eyes piercing into hers with a sadness that seemed to go on forever. "You must destroy the mirror that binds us. The mirror in the captain's quarters. It holds our souls, our pain, our torment. Only then can we find peace." Talia nodded, a sense of determination filling her. She was here for a reason, drawn to this place by forces she couldn't understand. She would do whatever it took to set these souls free. With a final glance at the faces, she turned and swam toward the captain's quarters, her heart pounding as the voices followed her, urging her on. The corridor leading to the captain's quarters felt endless, each step taking her deeper into the heart of the Andromeda. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and stretching as though alive, reaching out to her with cold, invisible hands. Finally, she reached the door. It was heavy, covered in a layer of grime and barnacles, but it opened with a single push. Inside, the room was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the soft hum of the ocean around her. In the center of the room stood a massive ornate mirror, its surface cracked and darkened with age. The frame was covered in strange symbols, etched into the metal as though by some ancient hand. And in the glass, Talia saw the faces of the crew, their eyes wide and hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. She felt a surge of fear, a primal terror that made her want to run. But she couldn't turn back now. She was their only hope, their only chance for freedom. Taking a deep breath, she raised her flashlight, preparing to smash the glass. But as she lifted her arm, a cold, clammy hand wrapped around her wrist, stopping her in place. She turned, her heart pounding, and found herself face to face with the captain. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and translucent, his face twisted in an expression of rage and despair. He opened his mouth, his voice a low, guttural growl that filled the room. "You will never leave." Talia struggled against his grip, her mind racing as she tried to free herself. The captain's strength was unnatural, his fingers digging into her skin with a force that felt like ice. But she couldn't give up. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let him stop her. With a surge of adrenaline, she broke free from his grip, stumbling back as she raised her flashlight once more. The captain lunged at her, his hands reaching out, his face twisted in fury. But before he could reach her, she swung the flashlight down, shattering the mirror into 1,000 pieces. The room filled with a blinding light, a burst of energy that sent Talia sprawling to the floor. She covered her eyes, feeling the air around her vibrate with an intense, otherworldly force. And then slowly the light faded, leaving only silence. When she opened her eyes, the captain was gone. The room was empty, the mirror shattered, the pieces scattered across the floor. The faces were gone, their souls finally released from their torment. Talia felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of peace that filled her heart. She had done it. She had set them free. As she swam back toward her team, she felt a strange lightness, as though the weight of the curse had lifted from the Andromeda, leaving only silence in its wake. When she reached the surface, she found her team waiting for her, their faces filled with relief and worry. "Are you all right?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. Talia nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "Yes, I'm all right. And so are they." They sailed back to shore, the Andromeda fading into the distance, its curse finally broken, its souls at peace. But Talia knew that she would never forget the voices, the faces, the haunting whispers that had called to her from the depths. The ship graveyard was a place of legends, a place of mystery, and now she knew it was a place of peace.